who's the biggest avoid or target of 2023? That and more this week on the couch. Fellow football guy Adam Harstad. Who's the one player you'll be avoiding the most, the hardest this year?
Yeah, I love you discussed this show topic with me, and I mean, you can attest we've been playing fantasy football for 10 plus years together. So I kind of play a little different than most analysts. But it's kind of like the anti-question for me. Like most analysts are trying to beat the market, whereas I'm more just trying to exploit the market. So for me, there's never really any big avoids, any big buys. If a player falls, I'll take him. Doesn't matter who he is. It's the old Joe saying that everybody has value at the right price. But I do like to look for little tiny market signals, um, and use them to break ties. And I've been looking at ADP for the past couple weeks, and the one that I just don't really get is Tony Pollard. Um, and so at his current price, which as of today, hang on, let me pull up. He's going in like underdog best ball drafts. He's going late second, seventh running back off the board right now. At his current price, I would say he's probably the guy I would be least likely to draft at the end of the second round. Starts making it into the middle of the third. I'm grabbing him. It's not a hard avoid, but Tony Pollard's the guy who I just don't really understand right now.
So, I mean, obviously, we're guessing or speculating on why the conventional wisdom has him that high. With that in mind, where do you think the where do you think you're out of step with the overall picture of him in the fantasy football hive mind so that you look at that ADP and you say, no thanks?
I totally get why he's going where he is, because he looks fantastic, and he has looked fantastic from day one. I was a day one Tony Pollard drafter in Dynasty. I've held him in places. I'm a big fan of the talent, but I think that the market is a little bit too in love with the rosy best case scenario and is ignoring a couple red flags that don't exist with players kind of in that same area. And the big one for me is that, I mean, again, I'm trying to exploit the market, and a lot of times the market will tell you things, and all sorts of markets will tell you things. And Tony Pollard has never had 200 carries in a year in his career, and there's a great reason for that. Ezekiel Elliott is an All-Pro player. We've seen other backups to All Pros. Once the All Pros gone, they get their chance to shine. Michael Turner and Darren Sproles in San Diego behind LaDainian Tomlinson did not get much run because they were behind LaDainian Tomlinson, and then Turner left San Diego. Sproles left San Diego, and they both were fantastically successful in new locales. And it's possible that Tony Pollard is going to follow that path, and in which case he'll easily justify that ADP. But sometimes when a guy's not getting a lot of carries, there's another reason for that too. And Bruce Arians said this back in 2013 with Andre Ellington. Andre Ellington was a guy very similar to Tony Pollard. He was a guy that people liked coming out of the draft. And he was just extremely explosive and talented in a limited role. Everybody who watched the Cardinals play knew that Ellington was a difference maker. And they would ask Arians all the time, why isn't Ellington getting more run? Why isn't Ellington getting more carries? And Arians just flat out leveled. He said, I was coaching in Pittsburgh. We had a back named Willie Parker, who again was very similar to Ellington, smaller back, extremely explosive, extremely talented. And I basically gave Willie Parker as many carries as I could. He was fantastic. I wanted to feature him as much as possible. Every time we had the ball, I wanted to get Willie Parker involved. And after a year or two, Willie Parker's body couldn't hold up to it. And I'm pretty sure that I prematurely ended Willie Parker's career by overworking him. And I don't
Oh,
want to do the same thing with
oof.
Ellington because Ellington is, I think a similar special talent. And Arians said that, and the next year, I don't know why, but he like completely changed his mind. He gave Ellington a featured workload, gave him like 18 carries a game in addition to all the receptions. Ellington broke down at midseason, averaged 3.3 yards per carry, was never the same ever again. And I love, just from a scientific standpoint, I like when people register their hypotheses in advance, test those hypotheses, and then confirm them with results, because I feel like that's the most likely path to getting to the truth. And Arians registered a hypothesis that Ellington can stand up to the workload, tested that
Yeah,
hypothesis, and proved
yeah.
that yes, he was right. So with Tony Pollard, there is a very real chance that he is Darren Sproles or Michael Turner. The reason he wasn't getting a lot of run is because solely because Elliott was there, and he's going to absolutely thrive this year. And there is a non-zero chance. I don't know exactly what the chance is, but a completely non-zero chance that he's more like an Andre Ellington or a Jarius Norwood or a Leon Washington or Meweldy Moore was always my favorite. These hyper talented difference makers who just dominate in limited work, but once you start giving them more and more and more carries, they kind of lose that thing that makes them special. Um, and I've actually tested. I did a study a number of years back where I looked at all running backs over the first 8 games of the season, and I sorted them into buckets based on how many touches per game they had. So, like, there's 5 buckets. The top quintile has like the most touches per game. They're averaging like 20 touches a game. The bottom quintile has like 12 touches per game. And I looked at how they did over the last half of the season. And the highest workload running backs were not only less likely to get injured on a per carry basis, they were actually less likely to get injured on a per game basis. Like, handling a workload is a genuine NFL skill. And it's coaches are smart. If they're giving a guy 300 carries, it's usually because the back can handle 300 carries. So when I look at Tony Pollard and I compare him to somebody like Josh Jacobs, who is going just a couple picks later, he was drafted in the same class, but he's had a very different career to this point where he's demonstrated that he can handle that workload and also demonstrated that he has that special upside too. I mean, I'd much rather bet on somebody that doesn't have that downside risk. And so I look at Pollard and I wonder if the market's just not ignoring that small risk, which I don't think is a huge risk, but it's a small risk that just doesn't exist for similar players in that neighborhood.
I think that you absolutely have laid out the why there should be caution. And I'll add to what you said. I mean, he did have his season end on a pretty gnarly ankle injury that required surgery, and it happened during the postseason too. So he's one of those players, like you're saying, we're yada some stuff that we should at least acknowledge when we're saying it's all upside. Uh, the Tony Pollard best case scenario is coming, and I like players like Tony Pollard. So I'm going to say I still will endorse targeting him simply because of the unknown upside. I love unknown upside. Like, we don't know. And the other thing is on the glass half full side, Adam, is that if the Cowboys are worried about Tony Pollard's ability, well, I guess the one thing against him is they only gave him a franchise tag. They didn't commit like 25 million guaranteed to him. They didn't decide, oh, he's the guy now, in terms of a money commitment. But they didn't make any moves. We were all wondering, are they going to take a running back? Maybe even people talking about them moving up for Bijan Robinson. Wouldn't that be a Cowboys thing to do? Hey, Brian Schottenheimer, what does he do? He runs the ball. But they haven't really done anything to indicate that they're going to try to keep Tony Pollard in his previous role. But some of the things you said absolutely should have more weight, because when they would ask Tony Pollard, he didn't seem to be upset. Us fantasy football types, he's so efficient, he's so explosive per touch. Why aren't they giving him more touches? If he's explosive, efficient per touch, more touches means more fantasy points. He's like, no, we're good. And I think you're right that we have to at least entertain the possibility that he is that good because he was getting spelled, because he wasn't taking a lot of the carries where you have the most punishment on your body. And one of the things you said that I think is great is coaches are smarter than we think. I think there's a lot of things that the fantasy football community believes they invented or realized, and NFL has realized these things all along. But Bruce Arians, like you said, he's actually one of the few coaches that levels with us. And,
Absolutely. I love Arians so much.
oh, if we just had, because we were talking about our wonderful guiding force. I call him the mayor of football guys, Joe Bryant, and I've discussed with Joe the idea. I think Bruce Arians was the coach that said something to the effect of like, if you if your kid was born and you don't miss the game, I'm mad at you. You know, like, you better
Right.
be leaving. Why are you still here if your kid was just born? So there's a lot of things where he understood that, hey, because I think there's a lot of stuff in NFL coaching culture. Well, I don't go home. I sleep in the office, and that doesn't necessarily even make you better at the job. There's so many things to sift through. Like, I just want to go back to what you said when you said you exploiting markets, and I think that markets are full of information, and like you said, messages. Uh, there's information in markets, so it can be something you can apply to this upcoming year or something you recall from the past. But like, give me a use case that is a kind of a how-to to exploit the market, like you said, not beat the market. Um, and then we try when we're successful to generalize from that and look for similar cases going forward. What are some and what's one in the Adam Harstad Hall of Fame, or maybe one you're looking forward to where you feel like there's a market to be exploited here?
My favorite by far, and I've been talking about this for years. So I play redraft. I mean, mostly I play with the Football Guy staff, and win quite often with the Football Guy staff. I'm the back-to-back champion in
Too
staff league. I do have
often.
to shout that out. We're gonna have to rename it to the Harstad Invitational. Um, but my true love is Dynasty. And part of the reason I love Dynasty is I got into fantasy football really for the stories, and to me, it's a tool for emergent storytelling. Um, and as an example, I'm my oldest league. We started in 2007, and there was a guy who's consistently been like the second or third best team for like the last 15 years, and he's never won a title. He's come close, a lot of semifinals and finals finishes, no title. And you could tell it was just wearing on him and wearing on him and wearing on him. And last year he said, screw it. Traded for Derrick Henry, traded for Travis Kelsey. He's like, I'm going to win this year or I'm going to like kill my team trying. But this is the year. This is my year. And he had, a really strong season, made it to the championship game, was going into that Bengals Bills game with Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, and just like a small deficit. And you think like this is going to be like the easiest cakewalk ever. He's like, this is his victory lap. He's going to get his coronation. Finally get that title that he's been chasing for so many years. And then, of course, there was that horrifying DeMar Hamlin injury. The game is canceled. Everything's kind of in limbo for a couple weeks. And I was incredibly impressed with how he handled it because we talked about several solutions, several resolutions, playing the game on a different week or whatever. And he said, no, this is part of football. Like it's part of the risk of football that like sometimes stuff happens. So I'm just going to go with the results on the field. We'll count it as another title loss for me. That's fine. It actually wound up working out well in his favor that the NFL basically canceled the game, so it didn't count at all. And we have like a backup rule where if a player doesn't play that week, you get his backup. And so Jamar Chase was ruled out. His backup was Mike Evans. All of a sudden, he won by like 50 points. Um, and this story, like I'm not going to remember a lot about this season, but I'm going to be telling the story about, adversity and overcoming it and showing, I think, an incredible amount of dignity and class in a very difficult situation and being rewarded by the universe for all that positive karma. I'm going to be telling that story for 20 years. And I feel like that happens a lot more in Dynasty than redraft. So Dynasty is my true love in fantasy football. But with that said, I'm in it for the story, but I like kicking people's teeth in while
Mhm,
I'm at
mhm.
it. And I think the best market inefficiency in Dynasty is young players who are rated higher in redraft than Dynasty, which, from a theoretical standpoint, largely shouldn't happen. If a guy's 23 years old and he's a top 20 redraft receiver, he should be a top 20 Dynasty receiver. And usually he is. But sometimes you get situations with, like Kirk Cousins last year, where the redraft community really likes him, and the dynasty community is like, well, he's really just not that good. We're lukewarm on Kirk Cousins. But the reality is, whether Kirk Cousins is good or not, if he produces like the redraft community thinks he is, and usually he does because the redraft community is very sharp, and these redraft values are very sharp. If Kirk Cousin has the season he's projected for at the age he is on a new team, everybody's going to all of a sudden be like, wow, this Kirk Cousin, he's only 24 years old. He's having a pretty good season. He's tied with Trevor Lawrence for the long term, and Kirk Cousins is going to creep up the boards. And so you can buy young players who are rated higher in redraft than dynasty and basically just sit on them for 3 months. And if you don't like Kirk Cousins, if you're not a Kirk Cousins fan, you can sell him for twice what you paid to get him in 3 months. It's basically like guaranteed profit. Although usually what's going to happen is you're going to be like the rest of the dynasty community and you're going to become a Kirk Cousins fan. You're going to be like, oh yeah, maybe I was sleeping on him a little bit. So that's my favorite is like evaluating talent and stuff is hard, but the redraft guys are basically doing it for me, and I can just leverage that in the dynasty marketplace for some quick and easy profits.
Just that simple, right? And it's great too
Yeah.
because, I love your you definitely win. you and Matt Waldman are neck and neck at the forefront of finding ways to work esoteric topics into fantasy football analysis. But when I ask you, what's the lowest hanging fruit? What's one of the easiest ways to exploit the market? It's something very simple. It's very simple. Just redraft folks. And it makes sense to me because in a redraft lens, your time horizon, event horizon, or I don't even know if I'm using that term correctly, is shorter. So you're only rating players based on what they're going to do through the end of the season. In Dynasty, you're looking at the entire range of outcomes. And like you said, if a player is young, if they're on the upslope of their career arc, then necessarily they should be worth more because they can become more in the future because they're on that upslope of their career arc. And so the redraft market in and of itself is internally consistent. The dynasty market in and of itself is internally consistent. But I think what happens, Adam, is once we're in the season, like you said, 3 months later, the dynasty players take on a redraft mindset, which goes back to the story that you were telling about someone really so desperately trying to win a title. And I should say, for editorial purposes, I am that person trying to desperately overtake Adam right now in the Harstad Invitational. And yeah, I love to tell the story about when you gave out candy at the retreat.
Yes.
Well, because it's both sides, right? You get into, and we'll talk about this stuff like biases, ways that we can use our brains to understand the limitations of our brains and then overcome the limitations of our brains. But also, hey,
Although that story is not a story about overcoming the limitations of our brains. That's a story of trying to overcome them and failing miserable. I don't know if you remember how that story
how
ended.
did the story end? And just for people to understand, at the first retreat, it was the first retreat you came to, right?
Yep,
And
2013.
we had just started our dynasty league, the Football Guy Staff Dynasty League, and you had a piece of candy for everybody. And I thought, wasn't that nice?
It was, I got a manila folder. Everybody in the Dynasty League who had Dynasty rankings posted on Football Guys. I printed up the rankings. I highlighted all of the players I had, and I highlighted all of the players they had, and I put it in a manila folder with some candy. And the idea is they're going to pull out the list. They're going to look at our respective players. They're going to eat candy. They're going to think like, oh, hey, we disagree about this. Maybe we can find a trade. And the clearest example was you and me.
Mm-hmm.
You had Russell
Oh,
Wilson.
right.
I had Robert Griffin III.
Yeah.
You had Griffin rated over Wilson. I had Wilson rated over Griffin. And I'm like, this is a slam dunk. I'm going to give Bloom some candy. We're going to talk about it. I'm going to give you my Griffin. You're going to give me your Wilson. It's going to be a win win. Everybody's going to walk away happy. We talked about it. And once we got to the point, I got loss aversion. And I'm like, man, I know Griffin's hurt, but he was just so special as a rookie. And I couldn't pull the trigger and I couldn't seal the deal. And I think, is Wilson still on your team?
I
Like
think he
for
was my
like 10 years.
forever. But the funny thing is, Geno Smith, who I picked up off the waiver wire, I was playing Geno Smith over him. And then to try to catch you, I traded George Pickens and a first round pick to Clayton, I think. I think it was Clayton or Chase. Clayton, I think, for Jalen Hurts in that push. And then Jalen Hurts was hurt during our playoff. I don't even know if I got to play you during the playoffs last year. Anyway, you mentioned the term loss aversion because I wanted to make sure to drill down just a little bit for folks that aren't familiar with Adam's work. Again, Football Guy subscriber, you're going to get access to all this good stuff. And there's stuff behind the scenes, just like Matt Waldman. There's stuff behind the scenes that you may not know Adam's fingerprints are on, but they're on there. You mentioned the term loss aversion. Unpack that for me.
So loss aversion is the idea that losses hurt twice as much as wins feel good. Like they feel twice as bad as wins feel good. So, for instance, if one day somebody says, "Hey, I found $10. You can have it. I found it in my pocket. Here's $10 for you." And the next day, you're reaching in your wallet and you thought you had a $5 bill there, and it turns out it's gone. You don't know what happened to it, right? That $5 loss is going to feel as bad as that $10 gain. Um, and it's been replicated in science that losses hurt more than gains, about twice as much. And there's good reasons for this. Like when we're living on the plains trying to eke out existence, it's important to hold on to what you have. And so we've been optimized to hold on to what we have, but it's not really efficient from a fantasy football standpoint because in order to overcome that loss aversion, you don't need a deal that's favorable. You need a deal that you feel is so massively favorable that like you're twice as likely to win as to lose. And then you leave a lot of money on the table. I thought Wilson over Griffin was like a 60-40 trade for me, but I was too scared. I had that fear and I couldn't pull the trigger. And I mean, as well as I've done in that league, I would have done a lot better had I had a consistent quarterback for the last decade. And so to overcome that loss aversion, I've started. I keep track of a lot of stuff I do. I keep records, and I have a thread on Twitter that it's a brief history of my terrible trades.
Mm.
And it's like, one time I traded AJ Green and Demarius Thomas and a first for Maurice Jones-Drew. He had one more good year and then was done. And like just these awful, terrible trades. Um, but they're in leagues that I've won a lot of titles. Like I've had a lot of success in those leagues despite those trades. And I'll revisit it a lot and be like, yeah, there's like a 40-45% chance that this trade just completely blows up in my
Right.
face. And I think about it for the next 10 years and I dwell on it. But the willingness to make these trades is what has led to so much success in the first place. So, like, if you run the numbers and you're good with it, just swallow down that fear and just do it. Like live life less afraid.
Yes. Yes, I like to say bet on yourself. I bet on yourself because if you're wrong, who cares anyway? It doesn't
Yeah.
even make a difference anyway, right? Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Oh, and also one of the things when I get too caught up in that fear and that anxiety that you talk about in life, Adam, is I feel like, well, in the end, either everything's going to work out and I won't remember that, oh, if I just hadn't spent that money, then everything would be okay, or it's all going to go so poorly that it won't matter, right? I mean, when we
Yeah.
project our life out 10, 20, 30 years from now, getting caught up on the micro decisions is maybe, I always think of Bukowski, the quote is something like, you would think the fact that we know we're going to die would make us love each other, but instead our life, we're devoured by trivialities, nothing. We're eaten up by nothing, and including fantasy football trades. My worst. I've never admitted this publicly, but you've emboldened me to do this. After his first year, I traded Christian McCaffrey in a dynasty league for Jordan Howard, Anthony Miller, and a second round pick, something like that. Oh my gosh. Oh.
It's funny. I in 2015, I traded Devontae Adams for Dion Lewis. And I crowed about that trade for like a
Mm-hmm.
year afterwards because Dion Lewis is like Tony Pollard. He's one of those guys who just looked in 2015. I don't know if you remember. He looked
Patriots, like first 6 or
special.
7 games of the season, right?
He looked amazing. I mean, he looked like, like Christian McCaffrey. He was doing incredible things. He was averaging like 4.7 yards per carry with a long run of like 11 yards. It was insane. It was just like 5 yards every time he touched the ball, 5 yard run. And then he got hurt and he broke down and it wore out. And then Adams at the time, I don't know if you remember, was just historically awful. He had one of the worst rookie seasons of all time. He was dropping everything. He just looked like Terrace Williams esque. He was
Mm-hmm.
just bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so excited that I was able to get out on Adams, I was getting Lewis on the upslope and selling Adams on the downslope. And obviously that's not how it worked out. That's another one where I think back to all the extra wins I would have had over the years if I still had Adams anchoring my receiver core. But the funny thing is, in 2017 or 2018, I had like the third or fourth best team in the league, and I got into the playoffs, and I got to the semifinals, and Dion Lewis just went off. And I
Mm-hmm.
hadn't been starting him all year. He had been on my bench all year, but I'd had running back trouble. And I started him in the last 2 games, and he just had 2 monster games. Him and Gronkowski were like the only good players on my team those last 2 weeks. And I got a little bit lucky in the matchups, and I won a title that I would not have
Right.
won had I not still been carrying Dion Lewis. And I think back now and I'm like, it would have been nice to have a decade of Devontae Adams, but would I trade that one title to take my chances with winning another one with Adams? And like, no, it all worked out. Even when it doesn't work out, sometimes it still works
Yeah,
out.
I cite at least once a week, Adam. I cite that old, uh, the old tale of the farmer. Oh, my son broke his leg. That's bad. Oh, the military draft came through and you didn't have to go because you broke his leg. Oh, that's good. And just keep waiting for the next chapter of the story. You don't know the significance of the event. You don't know in the end, and there isn't really an in the end. There's so many fun things to unpack here, and I want to add on one of my favorite rituals in fantasy football. When I do win a title, when I am lucky enough to win a title in one of my leagues, I always look at every player I had in my lineup, and I go back and trace the story of how did that player end up on my roster in the first place. It's a really fun exercise, and
That's why I love Dynasty.
yeah.
Yeah, and I play on Flea Flicker, and Flea Flicker has a player history tool
Oh.
where you can like click the player's name and it will tell you that player's journey through since 2007, since our league started. And it's incredible. Again, I know you do this too, where like you feel like this representation of the player is like actually the player itself. Where like you've said that if your team's performing really poorly, you'll just like cut
Yeah,
somebody who you
shake it
probably
up.
shouldn't cut just to send a message to the rest of the team. And I do the, like, oh, I'm glad that Dion Lewis finally won a title for me because he went through so much
Yeah.
hardship. He got so much scorn after
Yes,
that Adams
yes.
trade. The man deserves it.
Absolutely. Well, I always talk about like Adam when we get to the waiver wire because we do the waiver wire show. We used to only do the waiver wire show to week 11 or so because in redraft leagues that's about when it should cut off anyway, or at the very least it should be modified, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But fantasy football's gotten so big now that there's always going to be some segment of the audience interested in just about anything. Like there's people 26 minutes into the show that are still listening because we're talking about fantasy football and other things too. But I talk about during the playoffs, you pick up somebody to like get them a ring, like I'm gonna pick up whoever, like someone who's just hanging out, like Mercedes Lewis or something. Like I want Mercedes Lewis to get a ring, so let's see if he can at the end of my bench. You got to have fun with it. It's always fun. Uh, First, fantasy football I think is for mental health. It's a release. I think it's therapy. I think that it's a way that we cultivate and nurture connections with people, and then yeah, we want to win too, and that feels good. Like you said, I think I said way back when, and I've not even ever come close to being successful to achieving this as you have, Adam. But you want to make the league ideally not fun for anybody else. You want to make it so everybody's like, I don't even want to play in the league with that person, or at the very least, which I think you have certainly done to me. If you get a trade offer from that person, you say, well, I don't. This looks like a good trade. I'm just not going to take it. I'm not going to take it because I know it's going to end up being something I regret. Okay, you've done a lot of great work weaving into your analysis these kinds of things you talk about, loss aversion. So, for a primer or an intro or another discrete example for folks out there that are trying to understand how we can isolate the way that the filter that our brains present, the sum of our experiences, uh, that it distorts things, it can skew things. And if you can understand that, even though in some ways you're a prisoner of it, you can correct for it. So, what's a good intro or a good starting point for folks that are saying, I want to be better at fantasy football by overcoming myself?
The big thing is you got to track stuff. And there's really no shortcut around that because if you're relying on your memory is not an unbiased observer. It's not a video camera that is faithfully recording events as they happen. Your memory has a viewpoint, and that viewpoint is usually whatever's going to make you look best. Occasionally, I think for some of us with certain predispositions more than others, it can be whatever makes you look worst. I mean, sometimes my brain just loves making me feel bad
Mm-hmm.
and hate when it does that, but that's the reality for some people too. But for the most part, your memory is going to paint things in the most rosy light possible. I like looking at the player history on Flea Flicker because I'll forget that I had a guy and traded him. I'll forget some of the bad moves that I made. That's why I keep the thread on Twitter, and my memory tells me like you are a great trader. You only make good trades. So if you're worried about this one, maybe you shouldn't do it because you've got great instincts. You only make great trades. And so overcoming that starts with quantifying that and seriously reckoning with the reality that I am a great trader. I have no question about that. But being a great trader means I win 55 to 60% of the time and I lose 45 to 40% of the time. And I can point to trades like Dion Lewis for Devontae Adams that I loved and I was thrilled about. That was probably one of my favorite trades I ever made. And know that like even if my evaluation was correct, and I stand by it, Devontae Adams was an incredible outlier. Players who are that bad that
Right.
early never come back unless they're Devontae Adams.
Yeah.
Um, and Dion Lewis had incredible upside. The dude was just phenomenal. He reminds me a lot of Tony Pollard right now. I think maybe Dion Lewis is a little bit of the reason why I'm a little hesitant
Mhm.
on Tony Pollard because that used to be my type. That used to be my bread and butter. Mueldy Moore, Dion Lewis, guys like that. Um, Even if my analysis was right, there's still a good chance that it doesn't work out for me. And if you're not a good trader, I mean, I know I'm a good trader because I track it. If you're not a good trader, you need to know that too, because there's no quicker way to ruin your team than trading at a high volume if you're a 45% trader. There's no quicker path to dominance than trading at a high volume if you're a 55% trader. And the difference between a 55% and 45% trader is just so
Yeah,
marginal.
1 out of every 10
Um,
trades.
right. And it's also important to track like counterfactuals. Like these are the trades that I tried to make that were
Oh,
rejected.
gosh.
These are the trades that were offered to me that I rejected. Somebody offered me James Conner for Jameis Winston. And I'm like, no, of course not. You know, Jameis Winston had 4,000 passing yards as a rookie. James Conner is stuck behind Le'Veon Bell. I get that he's got draft capital. Turned it down. Obviously, Conner's been miles better from a fantasy standpoint, other than in two quarterback leagues, miles better than Jameis Winston. Um, and so you need to know. It's important to self scout. It's more important to self scout. I think it's more important to scout yourself and your tendencies and your success rates than it is to scout NFL players and your league mates. I like ranking them in terms of importance. It'd be know thyself. Second is know thy league. Third is know the NFL. Know ball. And I'll gladly say that like in terms of fantasy analysts, I'm probably bottom 10% in terms of like knowing ball. I'm not going to be able to scout a Tony Pollard and tell you like meaningful differences between him and Josh Jacobs in terms of style of play. I do a podcast with Matt Waldman, who you
Mhm.
mentioned is also very successful in fantasy, and it's fun for me because he's absolutely the opposite end of the spectrum, where he's like 99.9th percentile at the knowing ball aspect of it. Matt Waldman can tell you who's good. More importantly, he can tell you how good and why. And he's better than pretty much anybody else at that, and that leads to a lot of success for him. But for me, I think my big dominant advantage, first of all, is that I know myself, and then second of all, is that I know the theory, and then third of all, it's that I'm able to divorce my emotions from my team management. And there are exceptions. My dynasty team, as you know, is named "If Loving Rob is Right, I Don't Want to Be Gronkowski,"
Mm.
because Rob Gronkowski was my first pick in that league. It's got an insane tight end premium, and I held him for basically all of his career, even after he retired the first time. I did eventually trade him, which was one of the hardest trades I made. But there was, again, we're talking about deals I could have made. There was a time when you had Travis Kelsey and I had Rob Gronkowski, and you had Kelsey ranked above Gronkowski in Dynasty. Oh, you had Gronk
Right.
ranked above Kelsey, and I had Kelsey ranked above Gronk. And I knew if I offer Sigmund Gronk for Kelsey right now, he'll take it. I knew you would. Um, but I just love Rob Gronkowski
Yeah.
as a player. I love the joy he plays with. And I said, I know it's not optimal, but fantasy for me is more fun with Gronk on my team. And so in this case, I'm going to do the suboptimal thing, and I'll just if it fails, it fails, and I can live with that. I'm okay with that. And it failed pretty spectacularly. If I had Kelsey, I would be like the biggest juggernaut the league had ever seen. It didn't work out, and I'm okay with that. That doesn't bother me at all. But other than Gronkowski for the last decade, and Mahomes is that guy now, where like I just want Mahomes.
Mhm.
It's more fun watching games, watching Mahomes play, knowing it matters for me. He's so fun to watch play. It's twice as fun when it's meaningful for you and your fantasy team. So Mahomes is another guy where like he's going to retire on my team. People can make whatever offer, and people have made offers that realistically I should be taking, but he's going to retire on my team, and I'm at peace with that. If he gets injured in 2 years and I look back at all the hauls I could have gotten, I'm going to be at peace with that. But other than that, I mean, like I was saying with Pollard, I don't really have players I love and players I hate. You have said in the past, I'm basically letting my league mates draft my team for me, where I'm taking the guys that they don't want. And, my response is yes, but my league mates draft me a pretty good team, so I'm okay with
Yeah.
that. If nobody in the league loves Tony Pollard, if people hear my arguments here and find them persuasive, and I join a league and Pollard's sitting there in the late third, I'm drafting Tony Pollard. I don't care. If Najee Harris falls, I'm drafting Najee Harris. Any back Jamal Williams. I had so many Jamal Williams shares last year just because, like, he's kind of boring. He's not really sexy. He was like, when he was with Aaron Jones, it was that same thing where everybody's like, "Oh, Jones is so much better. Why
Why do
isn't
they
Jones
keep
getting
giving
all
him
the
touches?
touches?"
Yeah.
And I'm like, Jamal Williams must have something going for him if the team keeps giving him touches. So I had so much Jamal Williams, and then he gets. I didn't expect 17 touchdowns, but I get a lot of those unsexy guys. Cooper Cup, his huge breakout year was, believe it or not, an unsexy guy because
Mhm.
he's just a slot receiver. Um, so yeah, I'd say those are my three big things: is I know myself, um, and I know the theory. I can run through the underlying concepts, and I'm very competent in the things that I know. I there's a lot of stuff I don't know, and I'll be the first to admit, like, I have zero advantage here. I'm not even going to try. And there's some stuff that I know cold, like that dynasty versus redraft
Mhm.
ADP thing. Young guys that should not be going higher in redraft than in dynasty. I'm like 100% confident in that the entire class of players who fit that mold are collectively going to rise. Individual players might not work out. Individual players might work out great, but as a class, those assets are undervalued. And then yeah, the third thing is just I'll have a few rooting favorites, but by and large, I don't really care what my team looks like as long as I'm kicking my league mates' teeth in.
Yeah.
I want to be fun to play with. I want to be gracious and funny, and I want people to enjoy playing with me, despite the fact that I'm rolling them for 30 points
Yeah.
every week.
Yeah, oh, there's so much good stuff to sift through here, and I think that if you track, because you start to learn your weaknesses. I always feel like the audience we have, the football guys audience, is the best, the best. The Audible audience is the best. They're so forgiving. They're so kind. Even when I make a mistake, they'll say, "Hey, I love your work," and I just did you notice in your article you just put out? It's great. Um, and I feel like everybody that's been listening to the Audible knows my biases. They know I have a much worse blind spot than you do, Adam. It all starts with Lorenzo Booker, I think. Yeah, I'm still thinking one of these years it's going to work out for Naeem Hines, right? I believe it every time a coach says they want to get him more work. So they know to correct for my biases. I don't know to correct for my biases, but they do. Um, but it absolutely, if you track yourself, not just even how many trades you win or lose, and are you a good trader, and should you emphasize that in your management or de-emphasize it, you'll even start to understand which kinds of trades you always take the bait on, and which kinds of trades, almost like you're saying, Adam, if it's agonizing, if it's difficult, if the loss aversion, if the fear comes up when you're about to accept the trade, those are the trades you should probably make, right?
Yeah, I wrote about that once, that, like, I'm big on, like, heuristics, and heuristics are just super simple rules of thumb. And one is, if you evaluate a trade and you think it's a fair trade, the harder it is, the more likely you should make
Yeah,
it.
I totally agree. It's one of those strange things that isn't necessarily intuitive, that oftentimes the true buy low or sell high moments are the ones that really 90% of the people would say, "No way, this is a sell high moment. It's the moon. It's going to keep getting better." In other words, something you were saying about letting the rest of the league draft your team. uh, There's so much to profit to be made in just going the other direction of the herd. Just go whichever way the herd is going. There's a nice simple rule. If the herd is convinced themselves that something is true with certainty, then there's probably a E plus EV position on the other side of the herd. But like you said, you get clarity. One of the things I love, you're talking about trading and evaluating trades. If you really evaluate your trades, like plus 3 months, you won the trade. Plus 9 months, the other side won the trade. Plus a year and a half, you're back to winning the trade. Plus 3 years, oh, you got destroyed on the trade. So you can't
Yep.
even know. It's always just at one point in time. But you do get clarity of your own biases and your own weaknesses. And I really love that you brought up the trades that you weren't able to make, because there's so many times, most of the successful trades I can make, I don't end up making because I make what I believe are fair offers. I'll decide what happens to me, Adam, is a bolt of lightning. I'll be wild. Like, I want to get Darnell Mooney. I want to get some more shares of Darnell Mooney. I'll go across my league and I'll make what I think are very fair trades for Darnell Mooney, and none of them get taken. No, Darnell Mooney's a bad example here because he had that pretty bad injury, and we'll see how he does. Plus, now he's joined by DJ Moore, et cetera, et cetera. But there are often times that I try to trade for a player, offer more than what they're worth at the time, and then within like a month, their value doubles. And I just think to myself, I hope that team remembers that I offered them very fair value for that player before they blew up, just for the record. But things change really quickly. Like I like to say for redraft, picks that feel like reaches, and this goes to what you're saying about it's okay to let the rest of the league make your picks for you, because picks that feel like reaches become values, and picks that feel like values become reaches very quickly. Like sometimes after week one, you can look back right away and say, oh boy, that was not very well advised. In fact, we're wrong. Like you said, even if you're good, you're wrong 45% of the time. So we're going to be wrong a lot. This is one of those things too. And speaking of Matt Waldman, and he takes this arrow, I think, for everybody. He's willing to put out rankings that are way outside of the range of consensus, but the reality is going to be way outside of the range of consensus. The one thing we can say for sure, Adam, right, is that everyone's rankings are trash. Nobody's rankings. You could even do like the Fantasy Pro style and just boil it down to the average consensus ranking. Even that's going to look like trash, like a month or two into the season. So we have to have be willing to be wrong, bet on yourself. And you brought up Jamal Williams. I'm going to come all the way back around to an actual football topic, a specific football topic. Are you still a Broncos guy? Are you still a Broncos honk?
Yeah, I like all else being equal, I would rather the Broncos win than lose. But I have, like I have I think a pretty good perspective as a fan where I recognize that in the course of my lifetime, like the Broncos
Oh,
are incredibly in the black.
yes.
You know, 3 Super Bowl wins, like all those Super Bowl appearances until this recent run, they had more Super Bowl appearances than losing seasons in my lifetime. They were more likely to make the Super Bowl than finish with 7 or fewer wins. And so, yes, I think don't they have like the longest playoff drought now? Like they haven't been back since the last Super
Right.
Bowl, but like that's okay. They've never been a hard team to root for or follow. They've never been like reached the depths of the late Al Davis Raiders. They're always kind of an interesting team. So all else being equal, I would rather the Broncos win than lose. But like I don't have any problem with with them struggling a little bit. And I mean, if Carolina had beat the Broncos in that Super Bowl, I would have felt happy for Carolina because Carolina, I don't think has had
Mm-mm.
the success that the Broncos have. I think Carolina fans deserved that more than Bronco fans deserved it. But I was still happy the
Yeah.
Broncos
Well,
won.
we've got an interesting twist in the Broncos story this year with Sean Payton. And I want to bring up Jerry Jeudy because if you found this video on YouTube, Jerry Jeudy was on there. And for me, he's in a void simply because we're getting into some assumption of rational coaching stuff here too. And I like going all the way back to Tony Pollard or Jamal Williams. Sometimes where we think that we should invoke the assumption of rational coaching. Oh, this coach is irrational because they're not using the more efficient or more productive player more often. Is actually rational coaching, because if they use that more productive player more often, the player would break down. Or in the case of someone like Jamal Williams, he's good at being consistent or having getting the tough yard or otherwise. That I always say it's catnip for coaches, running backs that just run the plays it's drawn up. They don't try to rely on incredible individual talent to make three guys miss. They're just going to do everything exactly the way it is drawn up. But Jerry Jeudy is a bit of a riddle when we try to figure out what's going on with him, because the team drafted Marvin Mims. They still have Cortland Sutton. They still have Tim Patrick, who's going to be back. There's a lot of signs that they're going to be a run-heavy team. But there's Jerry Jeudy still hanging around ADP wise. Um, do you, when you see Jerry Jeudy and you see what his ADP is right now, and you bring to bear everything we have, because like you said, we have to look at, well, how has his career gone to this point, and comparing that to other careers that have gone similarly, what's the next chapter going to be? Are you more of a target, avoid, or maybe just shrug your shoulders about Jerry Jeudy?
Um, I mean, again, it's going to depend on cost. I'm looking up now, and it says he's like wide receiver 22
Rich,
in
right?
best balls right now. That's rich for me. One thing I do like, just from like a mental health perspective, I like making choices that have a lot of outs in my favor.
Mm,
Like even if they're lower percentage choices, like there's just a lot of outs. If I'm doing a trade, it used to be the idea that like whoever got the best player won the trade in Dynasty. So you would say you would trade like 3 quarters for $1 and you'd make out like a bandit. And now the market has corrected a lot where like the stars I think are being valued appropriately. And now I kind of like those like trade $1 for 4 quarters
mm,
because there's so many outs. Like if any one of those four things can just blow up. You trade whatever and you get like a second round pick, and that second round pick turns into, like Michael Thomas in a rookie draft or something, and all of a sudden you just crushed that trade. And it's unlikely to happen, but there's just a lot of unlikely things. They just give you a lot of things to root for. Like, okay, the main part of that trade, that's obviously not working in my favor, but things are still alive,
mhm,
and maybe I can trade that piece later on for something further down. And um, you don't get it as much in redraft because usually choices are just a single choice, right? Like you can't trade. There's not as much trading in the draft. There's not as much trading after the draft. But I do think there are players with like a lot of like negative outs. I feel like there's a lot of ways for Jerry Jeudy to underperform that draft position and not a lot of ways for him to overperform it. Um, Even if each individual way for him to underperform it is relatively unlikely, like maybe Denver leans more on its tight ends this year. Um, Probably not super likely, but possible.
mhm.
Maybe Marvin Mims is an instant star. Probably not super likely, but possible. Maybe Sutton comes back looking better than ever. Probably not super likely, but possible. I feel like there's a lot of ways for Jerry Jeudy to be a losing hand. Like there's a lot of cards lurking out there that can come down on the river, and there's a lot of outs for the other position. Um, so it's not. He's not a guy who I ever feel comfortable drafting. I will draft him because again, I'm able to divorce my emotions from my team management. If the value's there, I'll take him without hesitating. I mean, I've even been in a draft where like I'll pick a guy and I'm like, I can't believe you jerks made me
Yeah,
draft this
I
guy.
know.
Like, what are you doing? But I'll take him if that's where the value is. But I don't like him where he is right now. There's just too much uncertainty, and like Pollard, I get the bull case here. Sean Payton has never really presided over a bad offense, and even the Sean Payton devotees who have gone elsewhere have usually presided over pretty good, pretty productive offenses, at least from a fantasy standpoint. And he's probably the most talented receiver on that team right now, although I don't think he's as good as his biggest fans seem to think. I'm kind of with Matt Harmon on this, that he's like fine. You don't really need he's not like a compelling area where like you've got to upgrade from Jerry Jeudy to be competitive, but also he's not going to like
Mm-mm.
single-handedly be like a winning chess piece where like, oh, I had this is my trump card. I have Jerry Jeudy. Jerry Judy's just going to carry. So he's fine. He's just not one that I would feel good about drafting where he's going right now.
Yeah, I think you laid it out well when you said there's a whole bunch of ways that he can underperform the ADP, and I guess the one way that he can overperform it is something like Michael Thomas's role, uh, and having that role dedicated, staying focused, staying on the good side of Sean Payton, and really becoming
And Russell
and
Wilson
Russell Wilson.
resurgence, which
Yeah,
but if you're counting on a Russell Wilson resurgence, I think the bet to make there is Russell Wilson.
yeah,
It's not Jerry Jeudy. Like Jerry Judy's like a two-part bet. It's a parlay. You're kind of hoping for the Russell Wilson resurgence and for the right role. Whereas like if you're betting on Russell Wilson, it doesn't really matter if Mims is good,
hmm
if whoever, like or if you just want to bet on Sean Payton, I feel like Russell Wilson is the easiest, simplest bet with the fewest outs.
yeah, and it reminds me of Jackson Smith and Jigba getting uh, drafted by Seattle. Well, is this going to hurt Tyler Lockett? Is it going to hurt DK Metcalf? Is Smith and Jigba going to be relevant? Are they going to run more three wide receiver sets now? Shane Waldron and what he learned with the Rams. Well, the answer just all the arrows point back to Geno Smith. All it really means is this
Yeah.
is good for Geno Smith, and we can argue over how it's going to play out, but it's going to be good for Geno Smith. Hopefully, a lot of the stuff is going to be good for y'all. This is the time of the off season for pondering. And we're gonna have OTAs. We're learning some stuff about teams, but also this is like Adam said, this is time for self scouting. We always go the last 10 minutes of the couch, a little self scouting off the rails. There's this Adam. I know you and I could probably the sun could go up and go down, and we could not even come close to running out of topics and tangents that don't have to do with football, but somehow weave them back into football. But I want to ask you this: you have a beautiful mind, and I'm happy to be associated with you in any way, especially in our fantasy football world. When you go back and you think about your life as it has unfolded, and how you have created this mode of being in the world that is your special and unique mode that is Adam's way. Um, what's a book, a film, a thinker, moments where you saw yourself in the world as you were coming up like that? Yeah, that's me. That's my song. I know how to dance to that music.
Music wise, people always used to ask me what my favorite album was, and I always used to say, I don't know. I don't really have a favorite album. I like questioned the concept of favorite albums. And then, I heard Grace by Jeff
Ah,
Buckley, and that just dramatically simplified. Oh, okay, oh, it's Grace. That's easy.
hmm
Um, like that was one where like I didn't really get it. Like, do people like have favorites in music, or does everybody just kind of? And then I heard it, and I'm like, oh,
hmm
to me that spoke to me. That was the song and the album. Um, I like to say people think that like truly life changing events are much more common than they really are. Like Grace to me has been by far my most listened to, my most analyzed, my most thought about album. It has lived in my head since I first heard it. Um, but did it change my life? No. If I imagine where I would be today had I never heard that album, I don't think it looks the slightest bit different. And I feel the same way kind of about books. Like I've read a lot of really good books and really interesting books. Um, just from really all kinds of disciplines. Some good nonfiction stuff where like there's a guy called Daniel Kahneman who won the Nobel Prize in economics. He did a lot of research on these biases. Like most of these biases we're talking about, they come from research by Daniel Kahneman and his partner Amos Tversky. And he won the Nobel Prize in economics despite not being an economist. He's the only non-economist to do so because he studies psychology. And he basically created behavioral economics, which is the field that, like, before economists thought people are rational and they are rationally pursuing their self interest. And Kahneman and his research basically said, no, people are irrational, and they're not. They're just this bundle of biases. Um, and I read his book, and it goes into a lot of detail about all these biases, but also I think it's profoundly a pessimistic book because one of the biases it talks about is something called the bias blind spot, which is we're biased towards seeing these biases in other people, but not in ourselves. And he says, "Do I think that like reading this book will improve the quality of your decision making? Probably not. Research says this is probably not going to make you make better decisions. My goal for this book is to improve the quality of the talk around the water cooler after you make those
yeah,
decisions. Where like, oh, that was a bad decision, but I can now recognize why. And so that's another one where like, I my style of play is very influenced by these ideas of biases and fallibility and judgment. You would think that this book would have been a useful book for me, but ultimately, it's not. It was an entertaining book. Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I try to think I think that the moments and choices that shape and define my life are definitely not these bright red line moments and choices that I thought would be the ones. It's usually stupid little stuff that at the time you just can't recognize the importance of. I mean, the best example I give, um, in 2002, I didn't follow football at all. I mean, I grew up in Denver. I was a Broncos fan kind of by association because everybody in Colorado is a Broncos fan. And I didn't follow football at all. I was on a message board for video games for Baldur's Gate, if anybody played that back in the day. And one of the guys there says, "Hey, I'm really into this thing called fantasy football. Is anybody interested in joining a league with me?" And I'm like, I don't know anything about that, but sure, that sounds interesting. And it was back when there were no free leagues, so everybody had to scrape up like $200 to host it on CBS. And the guy's like, "I'll cover your entry fee. Don't even worry about it." Gave me like $20 to cover the entry fee, and that changed the course of my life.
Mhm.
I mean, that's a completely different place just because some virtual stranger showed some kindness to like an 18-year-old kid on the internet. And if you asked me in 2002, like, is this going to be a meaningful event in
Right.
my life? No, absolutely not. This is a nothing thing. I'm sure there were 100 things that happened that month that I would have assumed would have been more significant. Um, so yeah, I we were talking before the show. So much of what I do, I think, is to try to remind myself of the role that path dependence plays in our life. And dependence is the idea that where we are now is really just a function of where we started.
Mhm.
Why is Silicon Valley in San Francisco? There are some unique things about San Francisco that enabled it to arise. There's a very educated worker base, whatever. It's right there by Stanford, which was like the hub of technology early on. But really, it's because Hewlett Packard, the guys who started it, went to Stanford. Had they gone to MIT instead, Silicon Valley would have been based in Boston. But they started it, and then because they were in Stanford, other people who were making complementary inventions naturally migrated there so that you could get all of these effects. Same thing with like, why is Motor City Detroit? Like, there's a lot of advantages to that location. It's got the lake access, but so does Cleveland. But Henry Ford started his first plants in Detroit, and therefore, over the years, all of those advantages have accumulated, and now Detroit is Motor City and Cleveland is not. And a lot of the things in my life, I we talk about my username on the internet always used to be SSOG everywhere. Why was it SSOG? Well, when I was 16, I was a bit of a prat and very high on my own supply. And so my first email address, it was some sort of genius at hotmail.com because I was very convinced that, I was this revolutionary thinker as 16-year-olds are. Like, I had
Right.
the confidence that only comes with being 16 and not having been exposed to the outside world. And then I grew older and I realized how embarrassing that was. And so I wanted to dissociate myself with that. And so then I changed it to other names that had the same initials. And then eventually it just became the initials itself. My avatar is a crying elephant. It's because I wanted an avatar for that username. So I did a Google image search of SSOG. But my left hand was key shifted one key to the left, and I typed AAOF, and the elephant was the top result. And I keep it because it reminds me, like, this is my avatar because my hand was one key to the left. Had my hand not been one key to the left, I would have a different avatar right now. But that's kind of dominated my entire
Mhm.
online life. That's been associated with my entire online presence for the past 15 years. If you see that elephant, it's me. Even before I was using my real name when I was pseudonymous, if you saw that avatar, you knew it was me. And it's entirely a fluke. Where we are today is just it's a random walk from where we started. And if we start in different conditions, we wind up in a different place. If I had played Diablo 2 instead of Baldur's Gate, I would not be a fantasy analyst today. They were equally popular games in basically the same circles. They're both, 2000 era RPGs, computer RPGs, and my entire life would be different. So I like to remind myself as much as possible that so much of who I am and what I am and where I am is just random chance. It's the butterfly
Yeah.
flaps his
Yeah.
wings, and then halfway around the world, there's a hurricane.
Yeah, and what a Hurricane Adam. Yeah, and I like your idea of the things that we think are significant moments in our life, we don't recognize as significant when they happen, and the things we think are significant maybe aren't as significant as they feel when they're happening. And what I get out of that is just try to be present. Just try to be present because you never know. I always like to say, well, New Orleans, I could go off about New Orleans and the role it plays in my life. I say, welcome to New Orleans. Pay attention. Always pay attention. Your attention is what you have, really, in this world. You mentioned Jeff Buckley really quick. I don't have to wind this up, but um, yes, MTV used to be cool. There was one time that Jeff Buckley and I think Radiohead Creep, and I don't know if it was Meat Puppets or Crash Test Dummies, like the buzz clips were actual good, interesting music. It used to be, folks. And there's some stuff. Look up the story of what happened to Jeff Buckley. If you don't listen to Grace, Jeff Buckley, you got to give it a chance. And his dad, and his dad's music was incredible too.
Yeah.
I love having the chance to make music about football and fantasy football with wonderful people like Adam Harstad. We do it all for you because you're so classy.